Right, amazing. I think let's get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our part 3 of our Copilot series. My name is Melissa Lee Young. I'm Head of Marketing here at Generation E. So last week we explored how Copilot agents built using Copilot Studio can automate tasks, connect systems, and boost productivity across Microsoft 365. We covered different agent types from simple retrieval bots to autonomous planners and showed how they can be built using no-code and low-code tools. Through our live demos, we highlighted real-world applications like HR assistants, email drafting, and workflow automation, along with best practices for accuracy, governance, and integration to help teams deploy agents effectively. And in today's discussion, we'll look at how AI is rapidly changing the way organisations work and the important role Microsoft 365 Copilot plays in keeping that shift secure and compliant. While many teams are already using AI to boost productivity, it's also raising real concerns around data privacy and governance. We'll explore how Copilot helps manage those risks by working within your existing security and compliance frameworks so you can confidently take advantage of AI's full potential. And so today we have Sean Hartman, our Head of Information Architecture, Risk and Compliance at Generation E. Sean brings deep expertise in cybersecurity, governance, and Microsoft 365 security. He's led countless initiatives across data protection, compliance, and risk management, and today he's going to be sharing insights on deploying Copilot responsibly. So we also love lots of questions, so please post any questions you have in the Q&A chat box. And just to note, we'll also be recording this webinar and I'll share the details after the session. So with that, let's get started. Sean, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Mel. Good morning to those attending from Australia. Good afternoon to those that are attending from New Zealand. It's good to see a bunch of customers and people that are interested in this topic attending from all over the ANZ region. For those that have attended the prior two sessions run by Rosemary and Ben, this session is really intended to expand on that topic, on the topics of Copilot and agents and how we need to think about the security and governance of the security and governance practices for Copilot. It is interesting that many of the customers we're working with have several common concerns. Statements like, our data is a real mess and we can't deal with that. The question we often ask our customers is, how do you know that it's actually a mess? And it's interesting that not many customers can answer that question appropriately. So what this session hopefully will uncover is demystify some of these concerns and hopefully provide some practical solutions where these concerns may well in fact be valid. As we know, there is a generative AI technologies here. Let's be real, right? We're not going to get away from this. It's happening really fast. This transformation is happening at an incredible pace, and this is really no surprise. The data only confirms what we're seeing and experiencing. Statistics from Microsoft and others are showing that 90% of organizations are implementing or have an AI strategy in place, with approximately 75% of knowledge workers are using some form of AI at work. But there are associated risks. Many of the leaders that we work with and our customers are citing that their primary concern is data leakage. We are seeing some concerns largely with AI users bringing their own AI to work, and some of the engagements that we've been running with customers have been quite eye-opening because we're seeing the use of agents, the use of AI such as Google's Gemini, ChatGPT, and others being used in the organization without them even being aware that it's there. Obviously, we're also getting concerns that customers are finding ethical concerns about AI, right? So things like indirect prompt injection attacks. What are we going to do about that? How are we going to manage that? And then also, as governments worldwide recognize the potential risks associated with AI technologies to realize benefits for society, new regulations such as the EU AI Act, the NIST AI Risk Framework, these frameworks have emerged, but many leaders are saying that they do not know how AI is ultimately going to be regulated. And in fact, according to Gartner's Security Leaders Guide, we're more than likely to see at least one global company see its AI deployment banned by a regulator for non-compliance. Copilot is the UI for AI. At its core, Copilot works as a sophisticated orchestration engine combining the power of large language models with your organization's data. It leverages the graph, and the graph is really just a gateway to your company's data, your emails, chats, documents, meetings, contacts, etc. When a user inputs a prompt, Copilot's not just relying on the general knowledge of that LLM. It's using the graph to search for, retrieve relevant data that the user has access to before it passes that information over to the graph. To the LLM. It's ensuring that any output is actually relevant to the user's specific work environment. Agents, obviously, as has been mentioned in the previous two sessions, agents augment Copilot by adding skills and knowledge to automate these tasks and business processes. And Microsoft's ambition ultimately is to empower every employee with a Copilot and transform every process with an agent. The Copilot control system really is all the collection of tools, policies, and controls that help IT admins and business leaders protect the data, manage user access, and measure the business impact of their AI investments. If we consider the security foundations, Microsoft's commitments and control, trust is foundational. So data is secured at rest. It's secured in transit. Microsoft protects that data with encryption and rigorous physical security controls, data isolation between tenants. This is not something new to Copilot. This has been Microsoft's foundational commitments and controls right from the beginning. You control your own data. Right, Microsoft's approach to data privacy is grounded in their commitments to give you the control over the data you put in the cloud. User data and prompts remain within the service boundary, and they never leave that boundary. Importantly, Copilot respects these controls as well. Right, so it only presents the data that users already have permission to access. Your data is not used to train or enrich the models either. Prompts, responses, web search queries, and Copilot are not used to train the LLMs. And then Microsoft also includes content safety controls. Content filters are built into Copilot to protect against that harmful content and prompt injection attacks. So imagine, from a harmful content could be something as simple as providing a prompt to Copilot saying, show me how to build a Molotov cocktail. You're not likely to get a response for that, right? And then for content copyright concerns, Microsoft provides protected material detection and customer copyright commitments. All the information on those commitments are on the Microsoft websites. Whilst we acknowledge that Microsoft does provide security infrastructure and the other commitments around privacy, compliance, service boundaries, etc., there is a shared responsibility around this. Ultimately, organizations are still responsible for their own data hygiene and governance. This includes things like access to AI apps, right? How are you going to set up your access control policies? How are you going to protect and govern the data that you have inside your organization? And ultimately, user accountability, right? How are we going to implement and operate organization-wide awareness and security training? And that's really where Rosemary and Ben have covered off an awful lot about the user adoption pieces for Copilot. On the Copilot for M365 side, Copilot's architecture really is designed to respect tenant security boundaries and permissions. At the core of that, Microsoft Entra ID ensures that Copilot's access to data is governed by the same principles and policies that are already in place for all the other resources that you manage. There are no new data access permissions introduced. It inherently complies with the access that users already have. And then conditional access policies are there to enforce how and when users can interact with services and by extension Copilot. Intune works in tandem in much the same way that we use this with other Microsoft services to ensure Copilot's access to data is not just based on user identity, but also on the security and compliance status of the device that is being used to access this data. Purview provides several services that work together to ensure that data is protected with classification and protection, prevent data loss by ensuring that sensitive information is not inappropriately shared. This includes a little bit with Copilot as well. There is a new DLP for Copilot. It is a little bit basic at the moment as it only works with sensitivity labels, but I expect that Microsoft will introduce better features over time. And then we also need to be able to manage insider risk by ensuring that communications with Copilot are tracked and audited. So think of things like code of conduct violations, how we communicate with Copilot. Are we using Copilot in the right way? How do we track and audit those communications? And then finally, Defender for Cloud Apps. We need to be able to discover and assess the risk of these AI apps that might be used in the organization. It also allows us then to block and approve apps based on business requirements. When it comes to securing and managing Copilot, we generally put these into three silos. We call them baseline, core, and best in class. And these are typically determined by your existing licensing entitlements. So from a baseline perspective, for people who have Copilot and Office 365 E3, multi-factor authentication, anybody not doing that, just completely silly, and then audit logging. On the core side, we start adding things like SharePoint Advanced Management, which is an entitlement that is new from earlier this year. Anybody with a Copilot license has access to SharePoint Advanced Management features. And then working together with conditional access, sensitivity labeling, data loss prevention policies, unified endpoint management, etc. Best in class extends that to risk-based conditional access, the automatic application of labels, automatic removal of inactive content, which is really around data retention disposition, preventing data leak on devices by extending DLP to our device ecosystem, even on-premise repositories, and then detecting of non-compliant usage with things like insider risk and communication compliance. So as we think about how we begin that preparation for Copilot, part of the pre-deployment readiness, while we have technical governance capabilities all over the place, we cannot overlook the need for a real good Copilot or AI policy framework. Without it, organizations just face too many risks. We need to think about data and security, privacy risks. Copilot obviously has access to a lot of data. We need these guidelines in place for our end users to understand what they can and can't do with Copilot. And if we look at some of the recent reports that we're seeing on LinkedIn, other locations, we're finding that we're seeing users copying sensitive data to public AI websites such as Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, and others. Whilst we have the technology to block those, not lots of customers are using that technology in that way as yet. There's a lot of foundation work that needs to happen for that to be able to be efficiently blocked. So we do need policies to establish the guidelines around how we manage that. And then, of course, we also have that the risk of brand reputation, right? So there's a recent article that was published specifically for a report that was done for a government organisation in Australia, where a lot of citations that were being used and recommendations that were being made to an organisation were based on data that either doesn't exist or citations where the information that was provided was actually incorrect. And so we still need to have that human in the loop review process to maintain quality and accuracy. So we need a process to ensure that that's occurring. We also need to recognize that there is an evolution happening from chat to action. This critical transition, it's happening all over the place. Chat interfaces, so the early days of Copilot with the chat experience, it excels at suggesting what humans should do, but agents are a little bit different in that they can act. They perform actions, they click on things, they write things, they delete things, they move things. Human employees, on the other hand, when we're interfacing with chat experiences, may still be there, arrive with discretion and the fear of being fired if they're doing something incorrectly. So there may be some additional steps that a user's taking before they're using that data. In reality, though, AI agents possess neither of those qualities. They operate independently. So the biggest challenges from an agent governance perspective is not just technical, they're also cultural in nature. We need to ensure that citizen developers are building agents that don't break things or expose sensitive information. And while we know Copilot agents have been around for a little while now, but there are still, the way that we approve them, the way that we manage them, there are still a few gaps. There is a new update coming in October that's going to bring additional insights into our agent inventory pages, which is a great step, but there are still a little bit of a way to go. And fundamentally, most agents that are created are still going to be working with data in some form. So the rest of this presentation is really going to be around that data estate, how we're going to manage that data and how we're going to ensure that that data is protected. When we think about the principles of least privilege, Copilot's ability to leverage this information has raised concerns. Right now, oversharing from a Generation E perspective, we think about oversharing as the unintended exposure of sensitive or confidential information, whether it be prior to AI or with AI. Data repositories where users have access to information is critical to understand what information is being stored, where it's being stored, and how we structure data to ensure that the right permissions are being managed appropriately. Some of the common causes that we see for oversharing, default sharing links in SharePoint, site privacy settings that are set to public. We see this a lot with a lot of organizations that we work with. Broken permissions inheritance. We see this a lot with companies that are doing their migrations to SharePoint. A lot of organizations that we work with in those early days of their migration strategies are essentially lifting and shifting organizational sites into SharePoint and breaking inheritance, providing a similar look and feel to what they had on a file server. The problem with that is we still have SharePoint owners, and in many cases, the SharePoint owners are a group of IT individuals who now have access to all the data that is sitting inside of these SharePoint repositories. The use of the everyone except external users domain group, we're not seeing that very often. We recommend that people remove that we remove that picker. And then sites and files without sensitivity labels, right? So this is where we see a lot of challenge for organizations where data that is intended to be used only by certain groups are certainly being overshared. And this is where we'll be talking about some of these things a little bit later with Purview. So SharePoint Advanced Management. Now, it's interesting that a lot of customers we work with didn't even know that they have access to these tools. There are a lot of useful tools under the SharePoint Advanced Management portfolio. You'll find it inside the SharePoint Admin Center. But probably the most useful tools that we see being used today are things like restricted content discovery. So restricted content discovery gives us the ability to essentially buy time for those sensitive sites that we know might have some permissions issues or things that we need to fix. So with restricted content discovery, we can set up certain sites. I think there's about 100 that we can allocate today, where we can set those sites up to be excluded from Copilot search. The only challenge is it prevents all search across those sites as well. But it does buy you time for those sensitive sites to get those correct. Restricted access control is a relatively new feature where we have the ability to restrict access to SharePoint sites only to specific groups. Now, what that does allow us to do is take our hypersensitive sites, assign a group to that site, and if a user is not inherently in that site, even the owners of those sites cannot add individuals to those sites or share beyond the people that have permissions to those groups. Site access reviews are really there to delegate the process of reviewing reports to site owners. So similar to what we do with Entra ID access reviews, where we can send out access reviews to different groups of users, we don't actually use the Entra capability to do that. We can do that right through the SharePoint Admin Center, provide reports to our site owners, and let them review the permissions that are there for those sites. And then managing content sprawl. So we determine what sites have not been accessed in a period of time. We can then set these to read-only mode. We can archive them. So essentially doing an inactive site report for that. The other thing is reporting. So a new SharePoint dashboard is rolling out through October and November. It actually should have been here already. Microsoft's a little bit late on that, I think about a month to 6 weeks. But the new CMA dashboard will be available. That provides a centralized dashboard which consolidates all these reports into a single actionable interface. I don't know what it looks like. I had a look on our environment today. It hasn't rolled out as yet, so we don't exactly know what this is going to look like, but apparently all of these reports are going to be sitting in a single user-friendly dashboard that's even going to provide recommendations and the ability to automate some of these governance activities that we need to take on the data there. So when we look at the Microsoft Purview suite of tools, these are really broken up into 3 categories, right? Which we look at data security, managing risk and compliance, and then data governance, where we're extending data insights beyond just the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So information protection, data loss prevention, insider risk management, compliance manager, DSPM for AI, insider risk and communication compliance. Those are the tools that we're primarily going to be using, certainly with customers that are deploying Copilot and AI, because these are the tools that we're going to be using to manage those. And then we also have a multitude of regulatory and corporate compliance capabilities that through Compliance Manager, we can add these templates to Compliance Manager and start tracking against some of these regulatory frameworks that we need to be managing. And Copilot and Purview really work together to provide a complete solution to secure and govern Copilot, right? So on the security side, yes, we're honoring existing permissions, but we also need to be able to protect against data loss, insider risk. We need to be able to assess the oversharing risks and then apply recommended corrections against that. And we also need to govern that life cycle of policies, audit requirements, detect and investigate these non-compliant and unethical usage, and then guidance to remain compliant, right? So when we think about the Microsoft strategy for information protection and governance, it's really built around these 4 key pillars. Know your data, protect your data, prevent data loss, and then govern that data. And we need a unified approach to be able to do that. So we need to be able to discover, classify, and then apply various policies across that data that we have across our estate. And off the back end of that, we need to be able to monitor for these things as well, right? So we need to be able to provide audit trails, in some cases, proof of disposal with records management. We need a way to look at the content that is being used across our ecosystem, use things like Activity Explorer to see what types of content are being interacted with and how they're being interacted with and how they moved across the organization. So sensitive information obviously comes in many forms, right? We have business intellectual property, employee customer records, highly confidential information. We also have data related to geographical requirements, such as requirements in GDPR, the CCPA in California. There are other industry requirements for how data needs to be managed, how long we need to keep the data, when do we dispose of the data, etc. And realistically, Microsoft does provide lots of classifiers that attempt to identify the data that we already have in our environment. But it is important to understand that these classifications, these built-in detections really should be used as a starting point only. There's no way we're going to be able to go out and write a data classification policy that says take all this data that Microsoft is finding and start protecting it all out of the box, automatic protections, because there are lots of crossovers between different types of content that is being created. And a lot of that content does produce a lot of false positives as well. So we do need a method of managing that data. And realistically, your users will, or they should know what's important to your business. They should know what's sensitive. And so when we look at how we do sensitivity labeling, manually giving your users the ability to label and protect that data is the best place to start. And while that's happening, you can then get examples from the business of the data that they create, so that you can then go and build your own custom information types, whether that be sensitive information types, trainable classifiers, document fingerprinting, exact data match, etc. And those can happen off the back of a manual process to begin with, right? We have to start somewhere. So when we look at information protection and classifications, a lot of the organizations we work with, information must be classified in some way, right? In the Purview world, we call that labeling. Once it's classified, we can then protect that information based on the classification. And Purview provides both mechanisms, right? It provides both classification and the protection mechanisms for that. So as an example, when I first moved to Western Australia a year ago, and I had to fill in one of these forms for my driver's license, the form in its natural state is classified as official. It's an official document, but at this point, there's no protection required against that data. Until that data is actually filled in, that form needs to be treated slightly differently. And once it hits official sensitive, it has to be protected in a different way. And if we look at some of the labels, I've put up a scrape here of how Generation E does some of our labeling inside our business. We have things like non-business related information. You know, we're a company that allows people to use our tools and technology for limited non-business usage. We understand that people need to, they have lives outside of the company and they need to interact with organizations and other businesses. But part of the reason we have a label for this is so that we can deal with that data as well. So we can do things like create classifications, not just the classification that the data is personal, but also create retention and disposition policies that say, if it's non-business related data, we need to get rid of that data a lot quicker than we might do with things like confidential data that we need to maintain for a longer period of time. So in this case, we also have this confidential label where we have no protection around the confidential label. It's just something like a proposal we might send out to a customer. It's still confidential, but we don't necessarily employ encryption techniques across that because that data needs to be shared broadly within an organization. And with, customers obviously share that with other consultants and other parts of their business. So putting a protection against that doesn't make sense. But then we have protections for content that should be protected for employees only. So data cannot leave Generation E, it cannot be exposed outside of our business. The protection lives with the content. So even if it somehow got onto a USB device, was left at an airport, if you don't have a generatione.com.au address, you're not going to be able to access that data. And then we've also got trusted recipients, which is really where the user gets to determine who needs to be able to see that data. And that might be the case for environments where we have to share confidential data with people outside of our business, but we don't want that data to be shared overly broadly. Important to recognize is that Copilot also respects these configured protections, right? So if we're going to create new content, which is Copilot's creating new content all the time, whether we're creating summaries of content, whether we're creating new content based on existing content, Copilot does respect those configured protections. So we need to recognize that that is inherently built into Copilot, right? So if we're going to create a summary from a piece of protected content, we at least can inherit the highest level of classification from that, and the new content will also be protected. On the data loss prevention side, so DLP for us is really where we start looking at creating DLP policies to prevent oversharing outside of the organization. Generally, that's the place most of the customers that we work with are going to start. So things like protecting credit card information from being shared in Teams chats, as an example. We might block that for both internal and external use, but we can also create DLP policies based on existing data classifications. So if we classify data as being confidential internal use only, we could create DLP policies that block the external sharing of that, whether that data is protected or not. So for a lot of organizations, when they first start out, before they implement protections against the content that lives with the content, they may well use DLP as a method of stopping that content from being shared or emailed outside the organization. And then as we look into E5 technologies and endpoint DLP strategies, we can also then start using endpoint DLP to prevent sensitive data from being pasted into consumer AI apps. What is really good about this is we can provide users with policy tips, let them know why it's being blocked so that they have an understanding of what they can and cannot do. We can also, with endpoint DLP strategies, prevent sensitive information from being sent off to different areas like Box and Google and other locations. We can prevent printing of these documents. We can prevent copying of these to USB devices and other removable storage media. So DLP is really one of those key tools that is used as part of the data protection strategy as well. The next part of this is really around data security posture management for AI. So DSPM is the control mechanism within Purview that allows us to have a look at how Copilot and other AI tools are being used across our organization and whether any of those tools are using sensitive information. So two common scenarios that we see, shadow AI is gaining some of that visibility into the AI application ecosystem, how it's being used, what other AI tools are being used across the business, and being able to report on that. We can then make decisions based on that information. And then those Copilot interactions, right? So what data are we actually using to interact with Copilot? And then off the back of that, we do have insider risk solutions, right? So we do know that organizations face many risks from insiders. I guess it depends on the organization type, whether it's a user who is getting ready to leave the organization and starts behaving in a way that is a little bit different from their day-to-day activities. So things like large downloads of data, it may be data that is a user who typically interacts with 10 to 20 pieces of content every day, all of a sudden is downloading thousands of bits of data across the environment. That might be a trigger to determine that something is taking place, right? What that is, we need to investigate. And part of the insider risk solutions gives us some of those triggers and helps us use AI to produce risk analytics so that we can track where this is happening. Examples of insider risks also include things like data spillage, fraud, confidentiality violations, workplace harassment, conflicts of interest, etc. We need a way to be able to measure and track that. And then off the back of that, really when we start getting into advanced insider risk solutions is where we can automatically start doing adaptive risk protection, where automatically based on a user's risk profile, we can then start blocking access to certain things, ensure that they can't delete content, potentially block them from accessing certain sensitive sites, prevent sharing, downloading, all of that type of stuff. So that can be adaptive protection, which is an automated process for managing these risky activities that are happening across the organization. We also do need a way to be able to investigate for compliance and ethical violations, right? So these copyright violations, regulatory collusion, etc. We typically we haven't seen this an awful lot. We're in the process of deploying some of these tools for a lot of customers now. The communication compliance of Purview. In the old days of communication compliance, it was more looking at policy definitions to look for things like workplace harassment, foul language, behavior that might not meet with our corporate standards. However, communication compliance is now also extended into how we interact with Copilot, right? So we want to be able to determine if people are interacting with Copilot in a way that is really not part of of how we want people to be able to interact. So again, going back to that policy framework is ensuring that users are following that framework and ensuring that they're not communicating in a way that is not something that we want them to do. The other thing is we also then have the ability to enforce retention and deletion policies for Copilot interactions, right? So that could be meeting recordings and transcripts, Copilot chat. We could put those under legal hold so that we can use it for investigative purposes where users will not be able to delete or modify their chats in any way, which gives us greater visibility over what we're looking at. And as an example, from a communication compliance perspective, in this particular example that I've got here is looking for things like a condition has been detected where a user has asked Copilot to rephrase a message where we're giving away gifts, which is against the corporate policy, but we don't want it to sound like we're giving things away, right? We need to be able to track and monitor these things, and communication compliance is one of those tools that we're using to do that. And then really data quality and hygiene. So Copilot's performance and security are directly tied to the quality and the structure of the data it can access. What we're hearing from organizations, or what we're seeing quite a lot with the companies that we work with, is A lot of organizations are creating a lot of new content, and in reality, a lot of businesses are reaching and even exceeding storage limits, right? Which is leading to, in some cases, unexpected data overage fees. We find that a lot of companies really don't have a good strategy for managing data footprint, mitigating the growth, and what are they doing with that data as it's being created? Because in reality, a lot of the data we create is pretty stale, is stale pretty quickly after it has been created. So we need a method and of how we manage that data estate. Retention and disposal requirements are not being appropriately met. Probably the biggest challenge with data hoarding, employees wasting time searching for relevant information that's sitting in SharePoint that is 10, 15, 20 years old is probably not as useful to Copilot as information that's been created within the last 12 months. And so when we think about this data governance, we often think about data as being oil or currency to the business, right? The intellectual property that we're creating. Improper management of this data really leading to digital clutter, increased cost. I mean, we see an awful lot of organizations that we work with. And in fact, up until several years ago, we had the same problem at Generation E where using retention and disposition as a backup or archive strategy seemed to be quite a good idea because Microsoft has great tools in place and great platforms in place to ensure that there are multiple copies of data sitting in our data centers. If we're using retention and disposition as our strategy for data governance, well, that seems like a good idea at the time. But AI is now exacerbating some of this issue because a lot of that data is just growing. It's sitting there. It's becoming, we're holding on to data too long. I don't know how many organizations we work with specifically that have a retain everything forever policy, right? That does pose some challenges because whilst it may look to a user as though they've actually deleted data, we have this thing called the preservation hold library, which is still holding on to that data and still complying with those data retention strategies. So we need to be able to ensure that we're protecting and maintaining the data that we have. And what do we do with the data that we don't need? And then the other thing we need to be able to think about is, for data where we do have regulatory obligations, we know customers have obligations to retain data for 10 years, 25 years. We're working with customers in the health industry that have to retain data for up to 50 years and in some cases even whole of life. The reality is SharePoint is probably not the location for that. And so we've got to start thinking about where do we put this data once it's reached its useful life inside of SharePoint, right? And we've got to manage that appropriately. In some cases, we're going to have to start looking at archival strategies that still allow us to comply with those regulatory obligations, but without creating unnecessary angst and keeping in a place that it's not useful. The other thing is we have seen a statement from the Privacy Commissioner in New Zealand in 2023, really released after the largest data breach in the country, stating that 1.4 million New Zealand resident record data was compromised. So things like driver's licenses and passport numbers. The reality is a lot of that data had actually been there for over 20 years. And the findings from the Privacy Commissioner stated that data retention is actually the sleeping giant of data security, right? Should it have been there? Was there a reason to maintain it for that period of time, particularly given that some of that data was probably not accurate or relevant anymore? Because whilst a license number may not change, the dates and other things that are associated with it do. And then finally, building a data protection strategy, right? So it is a journey. We need to be able to do this in a structured way that doesn't over impact our organization. So for a lot of businesses that we work with, building that capability over time, we've got to get this right up front. The appetite to start again really is low when we get this wrong. So for a lot of companies, the way we see them doing this is start with the data classification process, build some DLP policies around how you're going to classify that data, protect that data, use DLP for Copilot in instances where we have highly sensitive information that shouldn't be shared, and then build information protection strategies around that as well. Right. We don't have to create labels that are visible and published to the whole organization. We can create departmental specific labels like for HR that only HR have access to. We encrypt and protect the data so that only people that are either part of the group who have access to that label or are part of the security groups associated with that protection have access to that data, so that even when we're creating agents that are using HR data that should be visible to other parts of the organization, we still have a methodology of protecting information that maybe shouldn't be visible to other parts of the organization. And then off the back of that is building on top of that with our insider risk management solutions, right? We need to start tracking how people are interacting with this data. How often are they changing the classifications? Why are they changing the classifications? What are the business justifications? Managing that, gaining visibility into how users are interacting and managing with it, and then looking at our data lifecycle management as well, right? Do we need policies in place to get rid of data that we don't really need to hold on to? You know, it's great that we have Christmas photos and, you know, photos from the parties that we had and, you know, cookbooks and all kinds of things in the organization that help foster and build, you know, tight collaboration between teams. But some of that data is just not useful. It's really not as important as some of the other data that we are creating and managing. So we do need to be able to look after and get rid of that data. And I don't know how we're tracking for time, but that is really where I wanted to get to for today, is just providing that foundation really to talk about data as being a critical component that does need to be managed, regardless of whether we are just using Copilot or agents. Right, we do have lots of technical solutions around how we give agents the ability to prepare in sandbox environments before it gets, you know, published and approved by others in the organization, and who it's going to be available to, how's it going to be used across the business. But at its core, we do need to be able to protect the data estate that we're looking after.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. We do have a few questions in the
yes,
chat,
absolutely.
so we can have a talk through those. But from Rodolfo, we've got some concerns about prompt logging from Copilot that goes into Purview, as it will sometimes contain sensitive or highly confidential information. Can we disable the logging of prompts without compromising any policies that we require for security?
You can, but realistically, if you don't know it's happening, you know, we want to be able to track and log these prompts. Really, who's got access to that, right? Because that is where we need to start thinking about who has access to the audit tools that we're using, where we're seeing those prompts be surfaced. You know, maybe we need to start looking at extending some of the permissions that we have beyond just IT professionals looking at that data, right? In some cases, we're going to have to start, this is a team sport, right? We absolutely are going to have to start looking at getting other parts of the business involved in monitoring and managing that environment as well. Whether that be compliance officers, human resources, maybe even people from legal departments, others. This cannot be an IT only function anymore. That's just not how it works any longer. IT is not often going to know what content is being created by the business, and in many cases they shouldn't.
Perfect. And thank you to Rosemary, who has also been busy in the Q&A box helping answer some questions as they come through. I know that Naimai has asked about some legal documents, I guess, that kind of talk about specifically for Copilot and SharePoint. So we can have a look for some links and I'll send those through on my follow-up email. There was another question that Rosemary helped follow up on about has there been any external security audits ensuring that data isn't passed outside of their Microsoft tenant, i.e. back to LLM for training? So Rose.
Yeah, I think we covered that off before. Copilot does not use any of your data to train the LLM. Right? It just doesn't do it. Now, that is part of Microsoft's commitments, which probably goes back to the first question that was asked around the legal documents. So Microsoft does publish it on their website, and yes, we'll go and get them and provide links to those, to that documentation. It also does describe Microsoft's commitment to ensuring that your data that sits within your Microsoft 365 tenant is not being used to train the models. However, that does not mean that people copying that data to a public AI site is not agreeing in some way, shape, or form that that data can be used to train the LLM. Right? We're specifically referring to Copilot in this particular case.
Absolutely. And also, yeah, thanks to Rosemary who's answered about a system administration. So the question from John was, does an organisation-wide Copilot deployment require a certain level of system administration to be factored into our resource planning? Just looking to get a sense of ongoing effort.
Yes. So again, as we've discussed, if you can roll out Copilot quite comfortably without any protections or controls, right? If every piece of information across your business is accessible and available to everybody in the business, by all means, go for it, right? But I've yet to meet a customer where that is actually the case. We obviously have legal documents. We have information about even employee data, right? Some employee data should just not be available to either Copilot or other parts of the organization. And the reality is there is no one single tool to manage this today. Purview is part of that tool suite. We have the Microsoft 365 Admin Center that is also part of that, where we can manage some of the elements of Copilot. We have the Power Platform environment. We have, there's just lots and lots of tools all over the place. And so having an understanding of that Copilot control system that I mentioned earlier in the session, it's a bunch of tools that help manage the Copilot journey, right? There's no one single tool. So yes, you need to be factoring in that you are going to need some controls and management and administration of this, right? It just has to be factored in. Even at Generation E, we're looking at it constantly, right? My role within the company, not just working with customers on their journey to protect and manage data, I've got to ensure that we're doing it inside our business as well. We also hold sensitive and confidential information about organizations. We create detailed designs. We have artifacts that have to be protected, controlled, managed, and ultimately retained or disposed of according to our internal policy controls and obligations as well.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Sean. It was so good to hear your insights and information that you presented today. I will be sending through the link to this recording and a copy of the deck after this session. So thank you for everyone attending. Please note that some of you may receive a form from Microsoft to fill in some feedback. So we'd really appreciate if you could help us out by filling that out. But that's the end of today's session. So thank you so much for joining, and we'll chat soon.